Some people spend so long believing they're a burden, that when someone finally tries to love them, they don't know how to stay. And that's what makes a silent voice hurt in such a specific way. Not because it's about bullying. Not even because it's about depression. But because it understands something most people quietly live with, the fear that your existence damages other people. And once that idea takes root inside someone, every relationship starts to feel dangerous. There's a moment in life that almost nobody talks about. The moment when loneliness stops feeling temporary, and starts feeling like your personality. Not sadness. Not heartbreak. Just the exhausting belief that you are fundamentally difficult to connect with. A silent voice understands that feeling better than almost any animated film ever made. On the surface, it looks like a story about redemption. A boy bullies a deaf girl when he's young, grows older, and tries to make things right. But that's not what this story is really about. It's about what shame does to a human being over time. How isolation changes the way you interpret every conversation. How depression makes you disappear from your own life. And how the deepest loneliness often comes from believing nobody should have to carry you. That's why this film stays with people long after it ends. Because most viewers are not just watching Shoya or Shoko. They're recognizing pieces of themselves. The story follows Shoya Ishida, a former bully who spent years tormenting Shoko Nishimiya, a deaf girl who transferred into his elementary school. At first, the bullying feels childish. Cruel, but immature. The kind of behavior kids eventually grow out of. But the film refuses to simplify it that way. Because when the consequences finally arrive, Shoya becomes isolated himself. His classmates turn on him. His friendships collapse. And over the years, guilt slowly hardens into self-hatred. By the time we meet him again as a teenager, he barely makes eye contact with anyone. He plans his days carefully. Avoids connection. Avoids attention. There are literal X marks covering people's faces because he cannot emotionally face other human beings anymore. And visually, that might be one of the most accurate depictions of depression ever animated. Not dramatic suffering. Not cinematic sadness. Disconnection. Early in the film, Shoya walks through school hallways while everyone's faces are covered by giant X symbols. At face value, it's a creative visual metaphor. He feels disconnected from others. But psychologically, the scene is doing something much deeper. When people experience prolonged shame or depression, they often stop perceiving social situations accurately. They begin assuming rejection before it happens. Conversations become performances to survive rather than opportunities to connect. So the X marks aren't just symbols of anxiety. They represent emotional invisibility. Shoya doesn't see people anymore. He sees threats. And eventually, when loneliness gets severe enough, this happens in real life too. You stop texting first because you assume you're annoying. You stop opening up because you think nobody actually cares. You start rehearsing simple interactions in your head like they're negotiations. Most people have felt this at least once. That strange emotional distance where you're physically around others, but psychologically locked outside the room. And what makes depression dangerous is that it often feels rational while you're inside it. That's why the film never portrays Shoya as dramatically broken. He looks functional. Which is exactly how many lonely people survive. Quietly. One of the most painful patterns in the film is how often Shoko apologizes. Even when she's the one being hurt. Even when she did nothing wrong. At first glance, it seems like politeness. Or insecurity. But over time, the repetition becomes devastating. Because psychologically, Shoko has internalized the belief that her existence creates inconvenience. And people who grow up feeling emotionally burdensome often develop this exact habit. They apologize for expressing needs. For crying. For struggling. For existing too loudly. Not because they're weak. Because somewhere along the way, they learned that harmony matters more than honesty. There's a scene where Shoko tries desperately to connect with others despite repeatedly being misunderstood. And the painful part is that she never becomes angry enough. She absorbs everything inward. That's what makes this so recognizable. A lot of depressed people are not outwardly emotional. They become quieter, smaller, easier to ignore. They learn how to disappear politely. And society often rewards that behavior because it's less uncomfortable for everyone else. But internally, the loneliness becomes catastrophic. There's a quiet conversation on the bridge between Shoya and Shoko that changes the emotional direction of the entire film. Not because something dramatic happens, but because vulnerability finally enters the story honestly. Up until this point, both characters are trapped inside distorted self-perceptions. Shoya believes he deserves permanent punishment. Shoko believes everyone around her would be happier without her. And both beliefs create the same outcome, isolation. This is one of the film's most important psychological truths. Loneliness is not always caused by the absence of people. Sometimes it's caused by the inability to believe you are worthy of being known. That distinction matters. Because many people spend years waiting for the right relationship to save them emotionally, while secretly rejecting intimacy the moment it appears. Not intentionally, but because closeness becomes frightening when you hate yourself. Near the end of the film, the X marks finally begin falling away from people's faces. And it's such a small visual change. But emotionally, it feels enormous. Because healing in a silent voice is not portrayed as becoming perfectly happy. It's becoming emotionally present again. Looking at people directly. Allowing connection to exist without immediately distrusting it. Accepting that your existence might not be the burden you imagined it was. That's why the ending feels so overwhelming. Not because every problem disappears, but because for the first time, Shoya allows himself to participate